Good afternoon. We're back with another Marvel Champions video. We have now arrived at the end of Cycle 3 with the Venom Hero Pack, and before we proceed into Cycle 4 with the Mad Titan Shadow, I want to talk a little bit about Cycle 3 because I found it very frustrating at times, and I want to talk about why that is. So the topic for today is going to be about the combo versus control meta. If you're new to card games or you haven't played many other card games, what I'm referring to is this balance that card game developers try to strike between a combo meta and a control meta. So a combo meta is when you have a lot of decks which are combining cards to become something more powerful than what they were on their own. And a control meta is a meta in which cards try to limit what the opponent can do. That's a simple explanation for more complex concepts, but I think it will do. And the issue with combo metas is that they tend to be hard to balance because when you give players the ability, when you give players the tools to create combo decks, you run the risk that they will find a combination of cards that is more powerful than what you anticipated, and they will make the challenges that you've set out for them trivial. Or if you're in a multiplayer game, you run the risk that the combo decks will overrun the meta, and you will be leaving players with only one viable deck option. Now, if you are in a control meta, the risk is that a lot of players simply won't find it very fun. Because combo metas are about telling players, yes, you can, and control metas are about telling players, no, you can't. As control metas are typically about countering what other players are trying to do, or countering what the counter deck is trying to do if you're in a solo game. Now, there's not really an issue with providing player cards that are control cards. Your players aren't going to find it frustrating to be able to limit what an AI encounter deck is trying to do. Control metas in competitive games are a problem though because players don't really like to be limited in what they can do. It's not fun. When you're playing a combo deck and you're playing against another combo deck and whoever achieves the most powerful combo wins, you may not like to lose, but it's more engaging to lose in a combo meta than it is in a control meta. It is very frustrating to lose in a control meta because the other player has effectively limited your ability to play the game. If you're able to play the game and you lose, it's more palatable than losing because you couldn't play the game, to summarize. And the reason why I'm talking about combo versus control meta relative to the Galaxy's Most Wanted encounter set is because I think this is the first time in a cooperative game that I've seen an encounter set that is trying to control what the players can do. This game, I've seen that on player cards from time to time where the developers deliver a powerful card or a powerful concept and then limit what it can do. I don't think that's ever a good idea. I think that's a really, really bad idea to design cards that way. I'll give illustrations of what I mean. So we'll talk first about two of the weakest heroes in the game currently. That would be Thor and Hulk. Now Thor is weak, not because his kit is particularly weak, but because he starts with a hand size of 5 and it only goes up to 4. Or it goes down to 4. It only goes up to 5 in Alter Ego, and it goes down to 4 in Hero Mode. Hand size 4, hand size 5 is a concept that I do not think should exist in this game in any capacity, except perhaps for Giant Form Ant-Man, where it makes sense to me. But Thor should have hand size 5, and Odinson should have hand size 6. Now you might say, that would be overpowered. Well, here's the thing. You want players who play Thor to feel like they're playing Thor. That would be ideal. At times the game does this really well. When you play Iron Man, you feel like you're building the Iron Man suit and then you're becoming Iron Man, who's really powerful, and the deck is limited in the early game, it's true, but it becomes so powerful in the late game that we can forgive this. Nonetheless, at least I can forgive it. A lot of players can't forgive the weak early game, though, and don't play Iron Man that much. But at its best, the game is designed, and it should make you feel like you're the hero that you're playing as. And here with Thor, we have a lot of tools to do that. We have Hammer Throw, we have Mjolnir, we have Lightning Strike. But then we have this limitation of the hand size 4, the hand size 5. Now, when you have a hand size of 5 in hero form, because you use your cards in hand to pay for your other cards, when you have 5 cards in hand, typically you have 1 or 2 play lines. That's just the nature of paying for cards in your hand with other cards in your hand. You're not going to have that many options because you have to use some of the cards in your hand to pay for the other cards. So typically there's 1 or 2 legitimate options when you have a hand size of 5. When you limit that to hand size 4, you take away decisions from the players, and you limit them to really only 1 option per round, and often that option is lackluster, and that makes Thor very frustrating because you can see the power that's available to you with Hammer Throw, with Lightning Strike, and it's great art with these cards. And they're powerful cards that are fun to play when you get to play them. But then the nature of the hero restricts your ability to play them. I do not think Thor needs hand size 4 or 5. I think he could be just fine at hand size 6 and 5. I don't think he would be overpowered. But let's say for the sake of argument that he was overpowered at hand size 6 and hand size 5. So what? Doctor Strange is overpowered, so what do players do when they play Doctor Strange? They ramp up the difficulty. Let's say that Thor at hand size 6 and 5 joins Doctor Strange in the ranks of elite heroes. So what? So you make players feel like Thor when they're playing Thor. That seems like a good thing to me. And if it ends up the balance isn't that great, well, you've provided players with the option of escalating the difficulty as high as they want to go. Let's say Thor is so powerful that he trivializes all content. So what? So players escalate the difficulty to Heroic 3 or Heroic 4. You've provided them with the ability to up the difficulty as high as it needs to go to create a challenge. But I don't believe that would be the case in any case. I don't think Thor would be overpowered with hand size of 5 or 6. I think he'd be fine. I think he'd be more fun to play. He'd make you feel like Thor. There'd be less frustration. Let's talk about Hulk. Hulk is in a very similar situation. He's been given tools to be very powerful with Hulk Smash, with Thunderclap, Unstoppable Force, these tools designed to make you feel like Hulk. And then he's been limited to hand size 5 or hand size 4 with a forced interrupt of discarding your hand. I don't really mind the forced interrupt of discarding your hand because Hulk's not a thinker. And that does make you feel like Hulk, that there's an element of random. And that's good because Hulk has an element of random about him, but limiting the hand size to 5 and 4 is not necessary and relegates Hulk to the dumpster tier, which is really not what you want for a hero like Hulk. This is going to be a massive disappointment to anybody who buys Hulk wanting to feel like Hulk when you play him. And it's not necessary. He could be fine at hand size 6, hand size 5. I don't think he would be overpowered, but again, even if he was, so what? So players escalate the difficulty level when they play him, as with Doctor Strange. I think it's far better in a solo card game, or not a solo card game, but in a cooperative card game to err on the side of making cards overpowered than it is to err on the side of making them underpowered, especially in a superhero game, which is all about power and making the players feel powerful. And if you've discovered that you've made too many powerful heroes, then simply escalate the power level of the bosses. Notice I did not say escalate the difficulty level, which is what they did in Galaxy's Most Wanted. I do mean that you can make more difficult challenges for players as they get more powerful player cards, but you want to do it in a specific way. You don't want to escalate the difficulty level by limiting what the players can do. You want to escalate the difficulty level by giving the bosses more things that they can do, so that the bosses are doing very powerful things and the players are doing very powerful things. And if you need the difficulty to be higher, then you give the bosses more powerful things that they can do. You don't take away things that the player can do, because that's a control meta, and that's very frustrating for players to experience. So, talking about the hand size 4, this came to a head in Galaxy's Most Wanted. With Drax, another 4 hand size champion with 6 hand size in Alter Ego, and then 4 in Hero Mode. I don't think this limitation was necessary for Drax. I think Drax would have been just fine with hand size 5. As it is, he's relegated to the dumpster tier along with Hulk. So let's talk about this cycle, the Galaxy's Most Wanted cycle, and the way that it frustrates players with its design. Go into the bosses. Each and every one of these bosses, with the possible exception of Drang, each of these bosses has a control meta. Drang doesn't really. I think Drang is fine. But each of the other bosses has a control meta. The Collector has his collection. When a card would be placed into a discard pile from play, put it face up into the collection instead. If you get 5 cards in the collection, you lose, so you have to get cards out of the collection, because cards are going to go into the collection. You're going to get minions, you're going to get allies, you're going to get an upgrade or a support discarded by the encounter deck from time to time. So you have to get cards out of the collection in order to not lose, and the way that you do that is by spending 2 resources or discarding 1 card from the collection. That is a control mechanic, because it takes away from what the players can do. Because especially on the higher difficulties, you have to exhaust a hero or spend 2 resources every round. And if you're spending 2 resources every round on removing a card from the collection, that is something that you cannot do with your own deck. Those are resources that you don't have to spend on your cards anymore. Similar situation with discarding 1 card from hand that limits your hand size down to 4 if you're in hero mode. That is not a good mechanic. Exhausting your hero also, that's a little better than spending 2 resources. So discarding a card, you don't have the option of doing that to remove a card from the collection. Discarding a card from hand, that's a mechanic that comes later in this expansion. But in this one, you remove a card from the collection by spending 2 resources of any type or exhausting your hero. Spending 2 resources of any type is a killer. You really don't want that to have to happen to players every single round. As a mechanic that could happen occasionally, okay, but it's so limiting in terms of what the players can do. And this is a difficult boss, but the difficulty comes from the fact that the boss limits what you can do by forcing you to spend 2 resources or exhaust your hero every round. And the problem with it, forcing players to exhaust their hero every round, is that a lot of heroes rely on their hero having their basic action available in order to do the cool things that the deck is designed to do. Namely, if the deck is designed to buff any aspect of their basic actions, their thwart, their attack, or their defense, if you take away that action, you've limited a large portion of what their deck is wanting to do or trying to do. And that's frustrating for players. And if you force them to spend 2 resources of any type, that's frustrating, because then they don't get to play as many of their cards. So what I would rather see as a boss mechanic is, I'd rather see the boss doing powerful things of his own. I would rather see cards going into the collection, and I would rather see them, I would not like to see you penalize the players for that by forcing them to spend 2 resources or exhaust their hero. I'd rather the boss gain stats or something like that for each card in the collection. Like the Collector gains +1 power for every card in the collection, or something like that. And don't make cards go into the collection from the discard pile. You need some other mechanic to put cards in the collection, like if the players get to 5 threat on a scheme, or put a side scheme into play that the players need to clear, or a card goes into the collection and the boss gains power. Make it so the boss slowly but steadily ramps up his power as the game goes along, because the players are slowly but steadily going to be ramping up their power as their decks go along. That's what nearly all decks are designed to do. They don't try to stay at their initial power level. They try to gain power as the game goes along, because the bosses gain power. You can see here from phase 1 to 2 to 3, the boss gains stats each time in additional challenges. So players are trying to have their decks gain power in order to match the challenge of the bosses. So if the collection had been designed to, say, have the boss increase his power as the game goes along, present challenges for the players to overcome, and have the boss gain power as the game goes along if the players fail those challenges, well, then you're not limiting what the players can do. You're increasing what the boss can do. And increasing what the boss can do is a way that provides challenge that doesn't frustrate the players. Because providing challenge by limiting what they can do, that is frustrating. And while there will be some players that enjoy that kind of challenge, there are always players that enjoy the control meta. The majority of players are going to enjoy the combo meta more. So provide challenge based on bosses escalating what they can do, not by limiting what players can do. The second phase of the collector, or scenario 3, Escape the Museum, I didn't really have a problem with. I'm not going to talk about it too much. I don't remember being too frustrated by this. Yeah, I don't really think there's a problem with this one. So let's talk about Nebula, which there is a problem with, and that problem is that this encounter revolves around evasion tokens, because when the villain phase begins, you place one evasion counter on a Nebula's ship, and then you have threat equal to the number of evasion counters, so you really can't allow the evasion counters to build up, or you will very quickly threat out. But the only way to remove evasion counters is to exhaust the Milano and spend up to 2 resources of any type. Once again, as in the collector scenario, you don't want to be limiting players by forcing them to spend resources every round, which is what you're doing here, because that takes away from what they can do. That's frustrating. Add to what the boss can do, don't take away from what the players can do. Combo meta versus control meta, and combo meta is harder to balance than control meta, but it's more fun for the players. Control meta is frustrating for the players. And also, why give players the Milano only to force them to use it, to exhaust it every round to remove an evasion counter? That doesn't make sense. Why give players a tool and then take that tool away? Why not just, I guess for thematic reasons, but this card could just say spend up to 2 resources of any type, and then they don't give you the Milano. Be like the same difference. I saw this design with Hulk and with Thor as well. They give you powerful tools and then they limit your ability to use them, which is very frustrating. Because you can see the power, you can see the potential of it, and then you also can't get access to it. Other ways that this encounter set tries to limit what you can do, well, we have the Stalwart trait, which prevents you from stunning or confusing the boss. Drang's Spear, okay, they give you, and once again, in order to get rid of Drang's Spear and play the deck the way that you want to play it, to do the things you want to do, stun or confuse the boss, you have to limit yourself by spending resources. That's going to be frustrating for players. In addition, this encounter set often has Pierce, which removes your toughness in case you were thinking, or it has Overkill in the case of Ronin. Let's talk about Ronin. Well, I mean, what can you say about Ronin that hasn't already been said? You do have some design that's increasing the power of Ronin, as opposed to limiting what the players can do. But that isn't really what makes Ronin difficult. What really makes Ronin difficult is this card, Fanaticism, along with this side quest, Kree Supremacy. But Fanaticism, if you look at just the Ronin hero cards and not the campaign cards, Fanaticism is a killer, and the reason is when Ronan attacks you, that attack gains overkill and piercing. The overkill is the big deal. Piercing is also a big deal because it mitigates what you can do. It takes away from your ability to counter Ronan. It takes away from your ability to defend against Ronan because you can't use an ally to defend against him because he has overkill and the boss will simply splash to your hero anyway, and you can't use toughness to defend against it because the attack has piercing. In addition, Ronan has the ability to gain stalwart, so it's hard to stun him, and if you're playing on expert difficulty, then you're starting out with additional power, at least 3 power or 4 power. We expect more power from the expert difficulty. That's fine. The Kree command ship is another interesting topic. It gives an additional encounter card, so that's additional power for the boss. You can mitigate it by exhausting the Milano and spending 1 resource. Okay. It's just that that's too much power. Because, well, it's not just straight power. It's also giving the boss additional control abilities. I would much rather see the Kree command ship, like, give Ronan +3 attack permanently, but you have the ability, if you exhaust the Milano, to remove some of that attack. Something like that, as opposed to giving Ronan additional cards, because a lot of his cards have control abilities. He gets Stalwart from Universal Weapon. He gets Overkill and Piercing from Fanaticism, so Stalwart gives him the ability to negate your stuns. Fanaticism gives him the ability to go through allies or through toughnesses. These are the ways that players try to control what the boss can do. So you have this kind of meta that's created by this expansion where the developers looked at what players were trying to do to control the boss, and they said, okay, we're going to have the boss control what you're trying to do to control them. And that's how they provided difficulty, and that ended up being very frustrating for the players, I think, because you're taking away from what they're trying to do. You're not adding to what the boss can do. I mean, you technically are. You're adding the boss the ability to control the players. That's not fun for the players. It's fun for players to control bosses. It's not fun for bosses to control players. And giving bosses the ability to do that as a theme in this expansion cycle, I think this will end up being seen, when all's said and done, as the most frustrating expansion in the entire game. Maybe the most frustrating expansion that FFG co-op games have ever had. There isn't one in Lord of the Rings that's more frustrating than this. I haven't played Arkham Horror. I don't know, maybe that has frustrating concepts as well, but I can say this is more frustrating than any expansion ever was in the Lord of the Rings cycle, in the Lord of the Rings LCG over its 10-year run. This is more frustrating than either the core set or the Rise of the Red Skull campaign by a long shot, and that is, in my opinion, because it's a control meta. Instead of just giving players the ability to control bosses, which is fine, they gave bosses the ability to control players, which is very frustrating. And what, in my opinion, should have been done is give the bosses greater power if you want players to have greater challenge. But give bosses greater power without limiting what players can do. And you would have had an expansion that's just fine. In addition, you have Groot in this expansion, and Groot is limited in his ability to gain power by this forced effect on his hero card. When he takes damage, you remove his growth counters. Without that, I think Groot would have been just fine. If it just said interrupt and not forced interrupt, I think Groot would have been just fine. Would he have been overpowered? I don't know, maybe. We may playtest that change just to see. We may playtest Groot and pretend that it says interrupt and not forced interrupt and see if he gets too overpowered. I don't really think he would have been. But even if you elevate his power by a lot, by changing that forced interrupt to just interrupt, you've provided a huge challenge in this expansion. Who cares if Groot is powerful? Don't you want Groot and Rocket to be able to beat the content in this expansion? Those are the pre-made decks that you've included. It would be good if players can use those decks to beat the content that's in the expansion. So I don't think Groot needed that limitation. I don't think Drax needed the limitation of the 4 hand size in hero mode. 4 hand size I don't think should exist. So when you combine all those things, what you end up with is a very frustrating expansion cycle. And it's frustrating because it's more control meta than combo meta. It limits what the players can do, and that's not what you want. Because some players will enjoy that, but a lot of players will feel very frustrated by that. And you really want a superhero game to make players feel like the superheroes that they're playing as, and you're not going to do that by taking away from things that they can do. So going forward, I would like to see this game and games in general focus more on a combo meta, give players power, and then give bosses or other players power to compensate. So that in a competitive game, players have 3 or 4 different decks that are all very powerful. And in a cooperative game, so that you have powerful bosses and also powerful player cards, so that players feel like they are playing as a superhero, playing against a super villain. And not so that they don't feel like they are playing against a super villain as a superhero who's been shot in the kneecaps. Anyway, thank you for watching.